Yeah, we back. Now today's gonna be a quick video, but in today's video, I'm gonna be giving one of my theories as to why, actually one of the biggest weaknesses of black nations, right? The reason why, in my opinion, there is a stagnation or lack of development in black nations. I'm gonna give my hypothesis that goes beyond the typical, colonialism and things like that. And, we already know what that's about. But in my opinion, I think in order to develop, right, we're just gonna jump straight into it. In order to develop a nation, in order to carry out projects and policies, you need to have what is called political continuity. And to put it in simple terms, political continuity is projects and policies that are carried out over a long-term plan across different administrations. And the United States is an excellent example of political continuity, basically meaning that when there are policies implemented that benefit the general public that we can all objectively agree upon, regardless of the different ideologies of the political factions, they can agree we're going to keep these policies in place because they benefit us all, right? Regardless if our enemies put it in place, our political rivals put it in place, we're going to keep it in place because it benefits us all at the end of the day. It benefits the nation and it advances our interests and our prosperity, right? And that is lacking in black nations. The greatest example of our lack of political continuity is when you examine all of our leaders that have been assassinated. Once they died, all their work, all their plans, all their accomplishments, all their vision they laid out, it dies with them. There is no continuity into the next administration that carries on that work. No, everything starts back from ground zero once again. And the political factions in black nations are really no different than the political factions in the United States. You have a nationalist faction that is more geared towards the prosperity and the well-being of the nation above everything else. Then you have a more, globalist, assimilationist, integrationist faction, right? So in the United States, the nationalist faction would be the Republicans. And in the United States, the globalist faction would be the Democrats, right? The internationalist faction. But even though both of these sides are political rivals, they can agree on certain things that they know will benefit the nation. And that could range from foreign policy, that could range from monetary policy, that can range from a variety of things. But they have a certain political continuity to where even though Joe Biden gets into office, there are certain things that Trump put in place that he'll leave in place because he believes that ultimately the prosperity of the nation will benefit from it. And the same in reverse. When the Republican faction gets into power, they keep some things that the Democrats put in power because they know everybody benefits at the end of the day. And that's what you call political continuity. Certain policies and plans put in place for the long term that are carried out through multiple administrations. Now, in black nations, we don't have political continuity. And this was highlighted when I got a comment in my comment section. I got a subscriber of mine. He's been subscribed to the channel for a while. And he's kind of like, he pushes back on certain things I say. And I respect him because he does provide good insight in the comment section every now and again. But he likes to play devil's advocate and be a contrarian on my videos, but it's cool. So, I be covering the West African politics every now and again, especially Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, among other nations, things like that. So I had a brother come into the comment section and he said, once the Western powers are able to get their man back in power through democratic elections, then all the policies put in place by the current presidents, the current military leaders, will be reversed, and all the old deals and contracts that were terminated will be signed back onto the books. Now, I had to be honest, that's a reality. That's a reality. That could happen. The Western powers could, like I said, they know how to manipulate elections. They could get their men back into power. They could back a candidate, put him in power, and then he could reverse everything that was done. He could put all the old contracts back on the books. We've seen it happen before. But to me, it really highlighted our lack of political continuity. Because what you have in black nations, we already know the manipulation of the foreign governments and the Western governments. But what you have is when our governments come into power, when our administrations come into power, all the plans and policies of the old administration gets wiped out, and the new guy comes in with his plans and he puts his plan in place, and then when he gets out, the new administration wipes him out, and then they put their plan in place, and the next administration wipes him out, put a whole new plan in place. And it's been 4 administrations. It doesn't been like goddamn 22 years, 30 years, and hasn't been any progress made because there hasn't been any long-term plans that were able to be implemented. And on top of that, you have the outside governments making sure their guy stays in power. So the only political continuity you have is the one implemented by the Western powers, because the nationalist faction doesn't have the same backing as the globalist faction, right? Because the globalist faction that's in bed with the Western governments, they got economic backing, they got military backing if necessary, they got the UN, they got NATO, they got their Western allies. But the nationalist faction in these nations, they don't have the same backing. They don't have the same resources at their disposal. They don't have the backing of the Western governments. The Western governments are standing against them because they're adversarial in their interests. So even if you do get lucky and you get a candidate that runs on a nationalist platform and he rises to power, he's going to have to deal with the sabotage coming from the globalist faction that's opposing them, as well as their Western allies that's backing them. And even if he's lucky to carry out a full term, as soon as he gets out of power and hands over power to the opposing faction, they're going to come in and reverse all of his plans, all of his policies, and the new administration is going to sign all the status quo bullshit back onto the books. And then it's this constant back and forth between the nationalists and the globalists, between the integrationists, the assimilationists, and the nationalists and the patriots. And also another thing you have to take into account, the things you witness at the highest levels of power in politics is really no different than what you see amongst the common black man and woman in terms of mentality, right? Even amongst common, regular everyday folks, you have a more nationalist faction. You have those who are more nationalists. You have those who are more, self-preserving. They want to accumulate and maintain power and prosperity for themselves and their group. And then you have those who are more, integrationists, assimilationists, globalists, who, want to integrate and things like that. Right. So it's the same thing at the highest levels of power. You have a nationalist faction and you have a, globalist faction. And to give an example of globalist leaders, in terms of in black nations, I would say, William Ruto of Kenya, he's very tied in deep with the Western governments. The director of the CIA went to meet him like last month. You know what I mean? Yeah. It's like Anthony Blinken went over to meet him, and they love him over there. So he's what you call a globalist leader. He represents the globalist faction. And I'm sure in Kenya, there's a nationalist faction that doesn't want to be tied down with the IMF and with the West and with the CIA and all this shit. But the globalists are in power in Kenya. In Senegal, the same thing. President Macky Sall, straight globalist. French companies be making millions and billions of dollars in Senegal. I believe the French military maintains a presence in Senegal. So, like I said, the Western powers got their men in power in those two countries, for example. And the more nationalist faction would probably be nations like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger that have pretty much reversed all the contracts and policies of the old globalist administrations and have went more towards a nationalist orientation, right? But that's a reality that the guy mentioned before, the homie in the comment section. He said, listen, they could get a different faction in power in the next administration and they could reverse everything that was placed on the books. All the policies and projects and plans could be abolished, overturned, put away, put on hold, and they never come to fruition. That's a reality that could happen due to the fact that we have a lack of political continuity, right? We have a lack of political continuity. We should understand that there are certain things that will benefit the nation above all, not just our political faction. Sometimes we're even petty, in black nations when it comes to politics, we're petty. We'll reverse the policies of a rival even if it's beneficial to the nation, but just because our political rivals brought it in to fruition and brought it to the table, they'll reverse it just to be petty sometimes. So, we gotta relax, man. We gotta relax. If you ask me, that's another big major source of our stagnation in terms of development, right? You can't have development that's not sustained across multiple administrations. Even if the globalist faction puts something into power that is a good policy that benefits the citizenry, the nationalist faction should keep that in, and vice versa. When the nationalist faction puts something in place that benefits the nation overall, when the globalists get into power, even if they're backed by the West, they should have the common sense and decency to understand that let's leave this policy on the books. Let's continue to carry out this project into multiple administrations, because in 20, 30, 40, 50 years, it's going to pan out and it's going to benefit the nation, right? You got to have a 50 or 100 year plan. You can't have a 4-year plan or 2-year plan just for your reign in power. That's not how it works. That's not political continuity. And we could talk about the political assassinations, but there have been political assassinations in the United States as well. But even still, that political continuity was still maintained. So even if you got a leader that is assassinated or taken out, or God forbid, he just has a heart attack, then his policies and projects should still be carried out into the next administration because it benefits the nation at the end of the day. It's not about your political orientation or your political faction at the end of the day. It's about the nation. Another example of our lack of political continuity before I go, A few years ago, the president of Tanzania, he passed away. They said it was due to a medical emergency. And he was what you would call a nationalist, right? He never even flew outside of Africa. I don't think he even flew outside of Tanzania. You know, he stayed at the presidential palace. He cut the size of his ministerial cabinet. You know, he lowered the salaries. He didn't really waste too much money on frivolous activity. He had his wife cook for him. He wasn't blowing money on the chefs. He was really just focused on the development of his nation, right? The national policy, really focusing on his nation. I'm not trying to fly to Washington. I'm not trying to fly to, you know, England. I'm not trying to fly to nowhere. I'm here in Tanzania. I'm running Tanzania. And, you know, he was a champion among the diaspora as well. You know, John Pombe Magufuli, you know, rest in peace to the ancestor, President John Magufuli. But when he passed away, the person who came in after him did not carry on any of his economic policies, social policies at all. You know, where he was a nationalist, she was a full globalist. And I believe she's now selling, you know, acres and acres and acres of land to foreign companies right now, like full-blown globalist. And I call that a weakness because, number one, we should be able to provide the same amount of support and backing to our nationalist leaders the same way that the globalist leaders have the backing and support and the military firepower of these outside foreign governments who interest they support. So the reason why our nationalist leaders are not able to hold on to power or really make effective change is because we don't give them the same backing. We don't really get behind them the same way our enemies get behind the globalist faction. So a lot of times our enemies don't even gotta fight us head up. All they gotta do is just sit back and wait until the next administration comes into power and signs everything back onto the books and reverses all the progress that was made. And this is also sometimes where you get these so-called dictators who they don't want to give up power after a few years because they said, listen, I won't be able to carry out my plans on my economic policies. I got to hold on to power for 10, 20, 30, 40 years just to keep everything smooth sailing, keep everything in place. And the same thing happens with the globalist faction. There's a lot of democratic dictatorships in Africa that are backed by the West, backed by France, backed by the United States, where guys have been in power since the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and they support their regimes because of the political continuity that it provides, because these men support the interests of foreign companies, Western companies. So these Western governments maintain the support for their regime to keep them in power, to maintain this level of political continuity. But yeah, man, I just wanted to bring that to the table. Of course, there's a variety of factors that go into why black nations are suffering the way they do. But I think that the lack of political continuity is one of the main ones that really hinder progress. The lack of just a commonality among the different political factions, where even though the Democrats and the Republicans might seem like they're beefing in the United States, when it comes to topics like foreign policies, certain monetary policies, there are certain things across the board they agree on. You know, so I think that we need to get more things across the board we agree on, whether it's the globalist faction in the pocket of the Western governments or the nationalist faction that wants to abolish the influence and power of the Western governments. They should be able to come to a compromise on certain policies and plans and projects that they know will benefit the nation in the long term, right? Because that is how progress is going to be made. These nations that are coming to power, you don't think China has a 100-year plan, 100-year plan, 100-year plan? That's going to be carried out over multiple administrations. Long after Xi Jinping is gone, they still going to be carrying out the plans he put in place today. So, we got to get our political continuity up, man. Yeah. Anyways, man, it's your boy Never Card. That's Salim back in the Billy. Yes, indeed. Cash App up on the screen, and I'm gone. Peace.